Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's online and in-person program titled Thomas Clarkson's Latin Essay, The Origins and Legacy of an Anti-Slavery Text. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director for the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all tonight and to host this program. For those of you that might be new to the Book Club of California, we are a nonprofit member and donor-supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a focus on the history and the literature of California and the West. The Book Club publishes limited edition, finely made books. We have a scholarly journal and club newsletter, and we have keepsakes for our members. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, California history, and much, much more. Now, if you're not a member of the book club or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest, the benefits are many, and we simply can't do the work of the book club without the support of our members. So I encourage you to go online to bccbooks.org to find out more or to join or donate to the book club. And now on to tonight's program. Tonight's program is titled Thomas Clarkson's Latin Essay, The Origins and Legacy of an Anti-Slavery Text. And our speakers are Dee E. Andrews and Christopher S. Parmenter. Dee Andrews is the author of The Methodists and Revolutionary America, which won the 2001 Hans Rosenhaupt Memorial Book Award for the best first book in the humanities by a former Woodrow Wilson Fellow. She has also written articles and reviews on the first abolition movement. She received her MA in history and PhD in history from the University of Pennsylvania. She is Professor Emerita of History at California State University, East Bay. Now, Christopher Parmenter is author of Racialized Commodities, Long-Distance Trade, Mobility, and the Making of Race in Ancient Greece, circa 700 to 300 BCE. The forthcoming Social History in the Mediterranean Iron Age, Poverty, Disability, and Enslavement, and articles on slavery and race in the ancient world. He received his MA from the University of Oregon and his PhD from New York University, both in the classics. He is currently assistant professor of classics at The Ohio State University. That's how you have to say it, right? The Ohio State University. Tonight, our speakers will discuss two elements of their new book, titled Thomas Clarkson's Latin Essay, The Making of an Abolitionist Author in the Age of Revolution. Our speakers will introduce the subject of the Latin essay itself, the significance of its translation, and how Clarkson reverses the formerly conventional argument regarding slavery in the classical tradition. Now, if you have questions for our speakers, please wait till the end of the presentation. I think Dee is going to present first. Oh, Christopher is going to present first, and then Dee Andrews will present second. We will have time towards the end of the evening for questions from you here in the audience and from our audience out on Zoom. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers, Christopher Parmenter first and Dee Andrews following.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to see all of you tonight. I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes on the intellectual history of thought about slavery. And then Dee is going to talk more about the book history and the 18th century history of this topic. If you are looking for sort of general overviews of what happened with the first abolition movement, we can talk more about that in the question and answer. But why don't we go ahead and begin with the origins of the Latin essay. The history of Anglophone social movements really begins with abolition. Between 1784 and 1793, a coalition of intellectuals, religious dissenters, bourgeois consumers, industrialists, sailors, and formerly enslaved Africans waged a campaign to abolish the transatlantic slave trade in the British Parliament. coordinating this moment was the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade, a subscription-based organization that orchestrated an unprecedented drive of mass petitions, pamphleteering, and lobbying. Now, every cause has its myths. Perhaps the central figure in the first abolition movement was Thomas Clarkson, a radical Anglican priest and co-founder of the London Society. Clarkson's origin story manifested a certain romantic sensibility. By his own reckoning, the naive and apolitical Clarkson was first introduced to the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade in 1784, when he entered and won a Latin essay contest at Cambridge on the topic On Liceat Nolentes in Servitutem Dare, or whether it's permissible to force the unwilling into slavery. Shocked by his discoveries, he translated, rewrote, and vastly expanded his prize-winning essay into the Essay on the Commerce of the Human Species, particularly the African. Now, when Clarkson joined abolition, it was a fringe movement dominated by Quakers, but Clarkson imbued abolition with the authority of Cambridge, the classics, and the church. Over the following decade, Clarkson ran an exhausting operation that combined scholarship, activism, journalism, and politics. He was in Paris in 1789, where he directly participated in the early stages of the French and Haitian revolutions. After 7 years of frantic activism, Clarkson's world collapsed in 1793. By this point, Clarkson's movement had floundered in Parliament. He was broke, his friends in France and Haiti were mostly dead, his friends in England were fleeing the country, and he suffered a debilitating nervous breakdown. Now, Thomas Clarkson's origin story was as a Latin author. Indeed, historians of abolition have always regarded Clarkson's Latin essay as a celebrated curiosity, but nothing more. After all, by the 1780s, Latin comprised a negligible portion of British literary output. What could possibly be the value of a Latin rough draft? Well, I'm a classicist, and I can tell you. In our forthcoming book, Dee and I position On Liceat as a key development in the transition of English historical thought from its humanist roots into a new empirical mode of social analysis. Now, Clarkson is actually famous for this, as his central project in life was the journalistic documentation of the transatlantic slave trade. But when he writes in Latin, Clarkson nearly exemplifies the culture that Stuart McManus calls late humanism, interpreting slavery not as an economic, but a moral problem. Beginning with a long disquisition on ancient slavery, Clarkson assails thinkers who defend slavery on the basis of civil law, the tradition of European jurisprudence stemming from the digest of the Roman Emperor Justinian. On Liceat sees Rome not as a source of wisdom, but a barbarous force that must be displaced. The transformation of his essay from a Latin moral tract into an English language treatise on political economy mirrored a broader shift in historiography from a moral enterprise to the pursuit of the fact. My part of this presentation explores how and why Thomas Clarkson made his revolt against the classics, and more to the point, why a contest essay from 1785 matters today. Let me begin with an overview of the manuscript before turning to what it means. So, Ane Liceat Nolentes in Servitutem Dare, 1785, is part of the Thomas Clarkson papers held by the Robert W. Woodruff Library at the Atlanta University Center in Atlanta, Georgia. The manuscript exists in two copies, Manuscript A, here on the left, and Manuscript B on the right. Manuscript A is written on gall ink, an unlined paper, and comprises 28 pages. Manuscript A seems to be the product of three hands: a rapid and inconsistent hand, a more careful hand, and finally Clarkson's own easily recognizable hand, which supplied the block-quoted Greek and Latin text. Manuscript A is fascinating because it includes many crossouts and emendations as though it's a rough draft, although generally speaking, it lacks the morphological errors found in Manuscript B. At the top is a heart-touching inscription to Clarkson's grandson, where he urges the boy to change the world, and we think he wrote this near the end of his life. Now, I won't have a lot to say about Manuscript B, and we've recently changed our mind on how to interpret this manuscript. If we can just go back to this for a second. Oh, here's Manuscript B on the right. you'll notice that the handwriting is much cleaner. It's made in secretarial hand. We had originally thought that maybe this was the essay actually submitted to the university for the prize, and maybe manuscript A was a rough draft or something. But thanks to Dee's research, we can now say that this is a copy made in the first decade of the 19th century. We don't exactly know why he had a copy made, but he did. The manuscript has occasional morphological errors in the Latin or hypercorrections, but it has no crossouts or emendations, and the quoted Greek in the manuscript lacks diacritics. Now, going back to manuscript A, you can see that it's burned along the outer edges up there. We know that Clarkson burned many of his papers late in life, and we suspect that this manuscript probably earned its burn mark at some point during that process, but it was removed from the flames, which is why we have it. Now, our book includes the first ever critical text and translation of Clarkson's essay. From an editorial perspective, this was a very easy text. Only 2 manuscripts exist, and they basically agree. And if you're familiar with how classical philology works, you have these very complex thematic traditions of, hundreds of different manuscripts of Virgil or Ovid, and you're trying to figure out which readings should be preferred. In this case, we have 2 essays, or two manuscripts written basically by the same person, and they basically agree. Thus, our editorial choices in creating a critical edition are prosaic. Our critical text preserves much of the manuscript's eccentricity. Now, one unusual choice made by Dee and I was to use a professional translator. Prior to my joining the project, Dee had commissioned Hannah Rich, who was then one of Emily Wilson's graduate students at Penn, to produce a stylized 18th century literary translation of the manuscripts. We kept Hannah's translation because it is completely brilliant. While some readers might appreciate a prosaic literality in translation, Hannah's approach, which John Dryden might have called translation with latitude, captures how English speakers processed written Latin in the 18th century. I emphasize this point because the text's punctuation and capitalization is clearly that of 18th century English. A modern translation would not have been appropriate. Now, I'll say a few words about Clarkson's Latin style. I recognize that most of you probably don't have Latin, but if you do have Latin, you'll be entertained. So generally speaking, Clarkson's style is approachable and is very similar to what you might have read in school if you did study Latin. Most of Clarkson's prose is what I would call the bland stuff of Caesar or Cicero, unless you love Caesar or Cicero, in which case it's riveting, exciting, you want to read more, etc. I'm not a Latinist personally, so but just to talk about how he constructs his meaning, he writes these long periodic sentences marked by parallelism, chiastic word order, consistent adherence to the sequence of tenses, and sometimes extreme separation between nouns and verbs. But in moments of rhetorical intensity, Clarkson adopts mannerisms associated with the Latin authors Sallust or Tacitus. This style is characterized by the use of reversal, bitter irony, or abbreviation. So for instance, in paragraph number 28, we see Clarkson write, "Imo potius ut princeps divitiis augeator, quanto an implora sunt crimina civium, tanto ditior princeps, tanto hic felicior, quanto nequiores illi." And Hannah translate this as, "No, it is more so that the leader might gain wealth. For the more crimes the citizens commit, the richer the leader becomes. He is happier the more wicked they are." So bitter reversal, irony, etc. Now, before jumping further into the text, I should provide you a rundown of its contents. Since I'm under the impression that, like most of the human population, you've not seen this text. The manuscript begins by overviewing the history of slavery from the ancient Greeks to the present. Moving on, Clarkson disputes the legitimacy of slavery under natural law. He debates an imaginary defender of the transatlantic slave trade, and he concludes with a harrowing depiction of the Middle Passage. This unique and awful depiction is honestly one of the most shocking things ever written in Latin, and I apologize we won't have time to talk about it tonight due to lack of time. But let's talk a little bit about the type of education Clarkson would have received and why writing in Latin mattered. So Greece and Rome were central to Thomas Clarkson's abolitionism in ways that might seem puzzling today. Educated discourse in the 18th century Anglo-American world was characterized by what various scholars have called a culture of classicism or a culture of taste that valued nearly all things in reference to Greek, Roman, or biblical antiquity. Antiquity was both a field of knowledge in itself and a political battleground, a space where contemporary debates might be allegorized into a framework of shared reference. From this perspective, some of Clarkson's honestly odder choices make a little more sense. At various points, Clarkson makes the completely ridiculous observation that Achilles or St. Augustine were actually abolitionist heroes. On the other hand, he makes some rather sophisticated comparisons between the non-state societies of contemporary West Africa with the Germans and Scythians of classical ethnography. As such, Clarkson straddles this critical divide in the history of scholarship, with one foot planted in an antiquarian mode, and the second in a mode that conceived of history as a sequence of facts. Now, Thomas Clarkson was the product of an education that valued rhetorical dexterity over all else. Clarkson had entered the culture of classicism at a young age, attending St. Paul's School in London on a scholarship. As late as the 1830s, Latin was still taught at St. Paul's using a humanist approach. The core text was a Latin grammar, written in Latin, first published by William Lyly in 1535. Boys were drilled in Latin composition using Erasmus of Rotterdam's De Copia Verborum, which was published all the way back in 1512. But by the time that Clarkson arrived at St. John's College, Cambridge in 1781, the Latin language was not often used in instruction. Nonetheless, the university still examined students in the argumentative style of Latin humanism. One annual ritual were examinations known as the tripos, conducted orally up to 1770 and in writing thereafter. Similar were periodic essay contests for cash prizes. In both, examinees would respond to prompts based on preset reading lists. These lists were remarkably conservative. Well past Clarkson's time, the university still drew questions from a Latin language handbook first published by Thomas Johnson in 1735, which was 50 years prior. Students were expected to be fluent in Dutch jurisprudence, restoration debates over the governance of the Anglican Church, and way more than anything else, John Locke and his theory of property. All of these appear on the reading lists of the now lost exams sat by Clarkson prior to the 1785 contest. And these photographs are courtesy of Dee, who did the archival work and found these. The structure of Clarkson's essay was narrowly tailored to meet the standards of a Latin language exercise known as the Disputatio. According to a 1649 manual republished in Johnson's handbook, two disputants should debate a premise, one proposing a thesis and the other an antithesis. The two then gather evidence from authoritative sources, either classical or from a preset reading list of early modern theorists, to further their positions. Disputants could not question the words of an authority. Rather, they must find another authority on which to stake an antithesis. Finally, disputants must be vigilant that their arguments not simply prevail by rhetorical style, but also from a logical perspective. All of this goes a long way in explaining what would appear to be the obvious factual inadequacies in Clarkson's argument. Humanist scholarship was not always about right or wrong. The past was a storehouse of moral examples from which you could freely pilfer. I'd like to end my part of this talk with a summary of Clarkson's argument. Clarkson believes that slavery cannot be permissible under natural law. Nature's basic principle is happiness. Acts that increase human joy are positive, and those that inflict misery are negative. All of the world's people are equal in their ability to express pleasure and pain from antiquity to today. Therefore, Any attempt to justify slavery via natural law requires us to deny the humanity of enslaved people. This argument was a striking departure from the Latin jurisprudence that Clarkson had read at Cambridge. Clarkson's main target on Liceat is Florentinus, the Roman jurist whose rationalization for slavery would prove foundational in Roman law. In Digest 154, Florentinus is excerpted explaining that liberty is the natural power of doing whatever anyone wishes unless he's prevented in some way by force or by law. Slavery is an institution of the law of nations, jus gentium, by means of which anyone may subject one man to the control of another, contrary to nature. Slaves, servi, are so called for the reason that military commanders were accustomed to sell their captives, and in this matter, preserve them, servati, instead of putting them to death. They are styled monocypia because they are taken by the hands, manus, of their enemies. Florentinus's rationalization for slavery was generally accepted in the early modern period. All people are free in the eyes of natural law, but it is permissible for some people to be enslaved under a carve-out known as the law of nations, jus gentium. During the height of the Habsburg Empire in the early 17th century, Florentinus's definition appealed to Northwestern European jurists because it effectively limited Iberian fantasies that any Catholic could be a natural slave, a doctrine borrowed at some distance from Aristotle's Politics. A line of jurists, beginning with the Dutchman Hugo Grotius around 1600 and ending with John Locke a century later, embraced this definition. According to these thinkers, it was only permissible to enslave convicts, debtors, or captives taken in a just war of self-defense. A more prickly but generally accepted carve-out was that following Roman law, these thinkers all agreed that enslaved status was inheritable. Such rationalizations were commonly cited by defenders of the transatlantic slave trade well past 1800. Clarkson takes direct aim at Grotius and Locke's acceptance of the Roman position. Clarkson echoes Florentinus near the beginning of the essay, and I'm going to quote Hannah's translation here and here. He writes in paragraph 11, "In the first place, it is clear from reason and from the history of those nations which most closely approach a state of nature that all men are equally free and have an equal right to the earth and to the fruits of the earth." Skipping a few paragraphs, liberty must be held to be a natural right, but authority to be adventitious, because all men from the beginning are equally free. Like Florentinus, Clarkson believes that all people have liberty by nature. But in Clarkson's Latin, you'll find the repetition of this troublesome adverb aeque, or equally, and the repetition of this noun jus, which our translator Hannah Rich reads in my mind correctly as right. This belief in intrinsic human rights grounded in the individual, not in the society, is the classic language of the Enlightenment. But it's striking how different this position is from the one held by Florentinus, from Grotius, or from Locke, all of whom regard liberty as a natural characteristic of human beings, but not an entitlement. What happened? It would be easy and correct to say that Clarkson was incensed by defenders of the transatlantic slave trade, who were using a shaky legal justification from 2,000 years ago to justify the mass deportation of innocent men, women, and children from Africa to the Americas. But this does not explain why Clarkson, who had been thoroughly drilled in 17th century jurisprudence, would have believed that liberty was an entitlement. Clarkson had taken this apparatus from Francis Hutcheson, a proto-utilitarian Scottish philosopher of the early 18th century who was a major presence on Cambridge reading lists. According to Hutcheson, the principle of nature is feeling, or sententia. All people, including enslaved people, are born with a conscience. This conscience, which is a property of the soul, can perceive the inherent rationality of nature. We feel good when other people are happy, and we feel sad when they're not. Therefore, that which spreads the greatest amount of joy is in accordance with natural law, and that which spreads misery is not. Thus, in Clarkson's estimation, governments arose from the state of nature to maximize happiness, which he calls the foundation of rule, patet felicitatem esse fundamentum imperii. People can only be happy if they are least constrained by authority, which limits some aspects of natural liberty for the benefit of all. Because people are intrinsically born free, liberty is inalienable in states that adhere to natural law. You can only justify enslaving Africans if their humanity is unequal to Europeans. And so that's the background of my side of the project. But now, for the rest of our time tonight, Dee can explain the book history and everything else.
Can everyone hear me? Yeah? Well, maybe not everything else. I'll try. Let's see, do I move forward? Does that work? Yeah. So this is about the reader response to the book that's based on the Latin essay and the legacy. So Essay on the Slavery was published in 1786 by James Phillips, the Quaker in-house printer for the London Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade, which I'll just refer to as the London Abolition Society, with blue paper on pasteboard binding. The tract was substantially longer than the Latin essay, expanding the manuscript's 43 paragraphs to 256 pages by incorporating an abundance of data from the natural sciences, natural history, and political economy. The original manuscript's, the original manuscript essay's passages were incorporated and unhighlighted throughout, so it was not indicated what was from the Latin essay. But from the start, the essay on the slavery was popularly perceived as the same thing as the Latin essay. This was an easy misconception given its subtitle, which you can see here, translated from a Latin dissertation, which was honored with the first prize in the University of Cambridge for the year 1785. Though the subtitle does indeed include the phrase "with additions." This is an understatement, to be sure. Am I going in the right direction? Yes. So reprints continued the practice of including reference to the Cambridge Prize prominently on title pages, indicating the importance that the elite Cambridge origin represented to early abolitionists. Here's one by Joseph Cruikshank in Philadelphia on the left, and Patrick Byrne, True. Yes, I'll get this down. Patrick Byrne, a radical Irish Republican in Dublin the same year. They were reprinted really fast. Clarkson's bookwork in the following years, from 86 to 92, was remarkable. More than 1,100 pages in print, nearly all published by James Phillips, virtually all taking the form of proto-investigative journalism. Nearly 350 pages in manuscript in the form of bound Rasoul, French manuscript books that were devised for circulation to avoid royal censors, and composed by Clarkson in Paris. He was in Paris at the start of the French Revolution, and translated for the Comte de Mirabeau, who was one of the leading members of the French Assembly. Here's the portrait by Carl Friedrich von Breda that Chris showed. Clarkson is holding what appears to be a manuscript copy of his second book, Essay on the Impolicy of the African Slave Trade, resting on a notebook of statistical tables, which is representative of his shift toward political economy. And regarding the power of images, and I think this one you have to turn your head a little bit, it got crooked. Clarkson has his own drawings of slave manacles on the left, and then there's a professional ink and wash drawing from one of the Parisian Rasouls on the right, which is replicating what he produced. Here is the Brooks engraving, Chris showed you this, of a slaving ship, probably the most famous graphic in all of anti-slavery history, hands down. Everybody knows about this. To this day, I swear, everyone knows. You can judge for yourself. It's a fold out in a cheap edition of Clarkson's Abstract of the Evidence, another of his books. This is a perfect example of the importance of preservation through the transport of books. This is my California angle here. The copy is in special collections at California State University, East Bay, my campus. It's signed by Mary Courtois in an 18th century hand, who was likely Mary Dales Courtois, the mother of John Thomas Courtois. These are Huguenot, Protestant French names. A big Huguenot crowd in Lincolnshire, and in fact, Clarkson was half Huguenot. Thomas and his wife, Mary Bailey Courtois, emigrated from Lincolnshire to Boston in 1829. I've tracked this down. She died, his wife died in Sacramento at the age of 91 in 1890. So this book traveled, 6,000 miles over the course of the 19th century, and obviously was clearly treasured by the Courtois family. Now, here's the interesting stuff. Readers had a great variety of reactions to Clarkson's essay. The first of these I'm showing is Benjamin Rush's Dream, written by an American patriot, published in 1787. Whoops, here it is. Published in 1787, and Matthew Carey's Columbian magazine in Philadelphia, just a year after the book was published. The main subjects are salvation of slaves, divine judgment of slaveholders, and spreading the word of print. And he starts by saying, it's what it says on the right, I seldom dream, and when I do, seldom dream of anything worthy of the attention of the public. Soon after reading Mr. Clarkson's ingenious and pathetic essay, meaning filled with pathos, the subject made so deep an impression upon me, on slavery, on commerce, and human species, the subject made so deep an impression upon my mind that it followed me in my sleep and produced a dream of so extraordinary nature that I asked my friends, what should I do? They said, get it published. Rush proceeds to describe a West African style utopia, now a kind of benevolent halfway station to heaven, where the spirits of slaves reside. I should add, Rush was deeply religious. The slaves' accounts of their lives were interrupted by the appearance of a little white man with the expression of grave, placid, and full of benignity. And it is the ghost of Anthony Benezet, who's one of the earliest of Quaker writers opposing slavery in Philadelphia. He carried with him a subscription paper and petition in one hand and a small pamphlet on the unlawfulness of the African slave trade in the other, meaning he's bringing with him literature. He's bringing how important all these pamphlets are and this print for ending the slave trade, especially basically through shaping public opinion. Then there's Ottobah Cugoano, whose book title, Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evil and Wicked Traffic of the Slavery and Commerce of Human Species, London, 1787, intentionally mirrored Clarkson's. The main subject was divine punishment of nations for slavery. Cugoano was kidnapped in West Africa, transported to Grenada, ultimately gaining his freedom in Britain. The image is by Richard Cosway, in whose house he worked. Cugoano's volume shared with Clarkson's essay on the slavery, a fusing of politics and passion. In Cugoano's case, producing what scholars call an anti-slavery biblical Jeremiad of volcanic ferocity. Cugoano quotes Clarkson's essay several times, including the judgment that concludes both the Latin essay and essay on the slavery. The slavery is a impious custom. It is contrary to reason, justice, nature, the principles of law and government, and the whole doctrine, in short, of natural religion and the revealed voice of God. Then there's Gilbert Franklin, coming from a rather different direction, a major Caribbean sugar planter and pro-slavery agent of the West India Society in England. And this is essentially addressed to Parliament, because the big conflict is going on in Parliament. The main subjects are judging Clarkson's credentials and the limits of freedom in a hierarchical society. And you can see the subtitle on the right. I don't think I need to read. I'd like to move forward, but basically he's writing a series of letters to a friend in Jamaica and claiming that Clarkson gets everything wrong. Among other attacks, Franklin states that Clarkson is a fraud when he posits that Essay on the Slavery was the same thing as the Latin essay, and that had the Cambridge Committee, including Chancellor Peter Peckard, seen what he wrote in the published essay, they would not have approved the thesis, much less given it an award. In fact, Peter Peckard salutes Clarkson's essay in one of his own writings and attributes his own larger emancipationist goals for Black people to Clarkson's work. Thus, through him, says Peckard, the teacher learning from the student, I looked upon myself as in some small degree a promoter of the glorious attempt to set the slave at liberty. But more tellingly, Franklin's main argument is that slavery isn't about race. So Franklin was well-versed in the classics, very cosmopolitan. Chris has analyzed this. Very well-versed and he's very cosmopolitan. And so he wants to say essentially, no, we're not picking on West Africans. This is not about West Africans. Don't be fair upon us. Today we would say, no, I'm not a racist. Slavery, he says, has always existed as a necessary part of the social order, whatever the race of the slave. The problem with this perspective, succeeding with public opinion, which was now the object of all these activists, was that the planter class failed to recognize how threatening their ideas were to white workers and the middling class. For if in fact slavery was not a racial system, but a class system, then what was to stop the ruling class from enslaving whomever they wanted of any race? And then I think most interesting of all is John Blakey's book, a great example of why it's important to look at the real thing, the real object. You book club people, you all know this. The main subjects here are Christian sympathy and living in a multiracial society. The owner was likely a non-slave holding farmer in Northern Virginia in America and a slavery state. Blakey marks a total of 48 passages throughout the essay, usually with the image of a pointing hand and a shirt cuff, but also including commentary. And here we see Blakey's remarks on the following. What is too bad for white people to do? They are the worst devils to the Negroes, he says. That's regarding a passage in Clarkson's essay describing a battle to seize slaves in West Africa. The real Christian is an amiable man, 18th century statement if ever there was one. And Christianity is the best morality, etc. That's regarding a section featuring an imaginary dialogue between an Englishman and an African at the start of part 3 of the printed essay, which proves to a demonstration that the Negroes are our brothers, all one stock. That's regarding a section on the origin of species as monogenic, all humans descended from one ancestor. Finally, regarding the legacy of the essay. International editions continued to feature reference to at least Cambridge or both Cambridge and the prize. The French edition, it was published in 1789, French translation. This was done under the leadership of J.B. Brissot de Warville, the head of the Société des Amis du Noir in Paris. They published a combined edition of, this is on the left, of Essay on the Policy, and an abridged version of Essay on the Slavery. This was done in Neuchâtel, Switzerland, again to evade royal censorship. The Swedish edition was published in 1796. This may sound surprising, but it was likely the result of Clarkson's close connections with 2 Swedish officials and expeditioners from the African continent, and Sweden had quite a great interest in West Africa. Likewise, regarding American reprints, the ad in the Philadelphia Repository for the 1804 reprint refers to the prize, and it appears again on the published title page of the book, owned by James Rush, who is Benjamin's son. The advertisement, by the way, also suggests another response to Clarkson's essay, noting it is written in a style of elegance, which recommends it to the polite reader, and it is replete with arguments which will render it interesting to the friends of humanity, suggesting that by this time, In places like Philadelphia, abolitionism had become a respectable cause. This is quite a shift from before the Revolution. And in 1816, Kentucky abolitionists published another unabridged edition. You may be surprised to know Kentucky was a slave state, with reference to the Latin essay in its title. This is 30 years after Clarkson won the prize. This one was owned by John Breckinridge, a member of the powerful, in fact, a slaveholding family. There are various reasons why that might be, but it might also be a case of knowing your enemy. And this pattern continued in personal and corporate libraries. Here's George Dillwyn's personal library citing the essay. George Dillwyn was the brother of a very important expat abolitionist in London. Here's the catalog, printed catalog of the New York Historical Society, showing the same thing and carefully putting into the catalog. This has won the prize at Cambridge. Nor did it end there in either the US or Britain. More express associations between Clarkson's Latin essay and his emergence as a major activist would follow. This is Alexander Crummell, Episcopal priest ordained in Boston, and ultimately the first Black graduate of Cambridge University. His memorial eulogium was delivered in New York City in December 1846, just a couple of months after Clarkson's death. He says, "I have no language by which to express adequately the intense and painful interest excited by this subject in Mr. Clarkson's mind when working on the Latin essay." And here you begin to see a shift into what is it that inspired Clarkson to do what he did. And then there's the Leeds Anti-Slavery Association in Britain in 1854. On the first page at the top of the flyer, the association reproduces their own version of the second most important graphic in anti-slavery history, derived from the Wedgwood medallion. It's an enslaved man and an enslaved woman kneeling in supplication. The flyer announced a fundraising drive for a prize competition of £200, £100 for the second best. That's a lot of money in 1854. And the prize it announces will be the means of awakening dormant energies in people interested in pursuing abolition. The second page has the headline, "The Extraordinary Result of a Prize Essay in Awakening the Mind of Thomas Clarkson," etc. Here it is again, the prize essay. And into our own time, this is on the web, first introduced announced in 2024. Sorry, applications are closed for 2025, named, of course, after Clarkson's mentor, Peter Peckard. Magdalen College invites undergraduate students at the University of Cambridge to submit entries for the annual Peter Peckard Memorial Prize, which recognizes an outstanding essay on modern-day slavery and exploitation. What's the inspiration? As vice chancellor of the university in 1784, Peckard set the undergraduate's prize topic, Clarkson's Latin essay. Yet again, there it is again. This was 2 years ago. In conclusion, the question remains, why has the Latin essay endured as long as it has? Was it simply a matter of highlighting it on title pages, or something more going on? Or more to the point, why were readers and printers, translators and eulogists, and now scholars and prize donors so taken with the idea of the Latin essay, not least of all, given that they had or could have read the original? There are multiple answers to this question, but two stand out. There you go. Here, for example, is another excerpt from the 1854 Leeds broadside recruiting essays regarding its new prize. Here then was the grand result of the university prize essay. Although the youthful student could not extinguish his desire for worldly interests and honors all at once, the sense of duty and holiness of the cause he had espoused crept closer to his heart, and he never relinquished it, but dedicated his whole life to the sacred cause of freedom. That's in the broadside. Here's what Clarkson says, very similar. "But all my pleasure was dampened by the facts which are now continually before me. It was but one gloomy subject from morning till night. In the daytime I was uneasy. At night I had little rest. I sometimes never closed my eyelids for grief." This passage, however, is in neither the original Latin essay nor its much extended published version. Instead, it appears in Clarkson's 1808 best-selling history of abolition. And here's the title. And here's the history in its original binding, again, blue paper and pasteboard at the Great Huntington Library. Wonderful original edition, originally bound edition. So one reason why activist readers and scholars have prized the idea of the Latin essay for so long is simply because Clarkson told them to. But there are two larger morals to the legacy of the Latin essay. So I will close here. First, Clarkson provided the first abolition movement with an unexpected artifact, an essay built on classical studies and produced at one of Britain's two exclusive universities that nevertheless attacked one of Britain's most profitable and modern forms of commerce. And equally important, by the time he wrote History of the Abolition, Clarkson had himself come to know that for any movement, nothing has quite the power as the story of an individual's conversion to the cause. In short, there's perhaps no more suitable symbol than the Latin essay for how early abolition was not just the fundamental social movement of the time. It also represented a major turning point from the old world to the new, and the transformation of a young romantic in the age of revolution into a lifelong modern social activist. Oops, I didn't forward as much as I might. Here, a few more things. There you go. Thank you.
You might have some questions.
Yeah.
Stay at the microphone. Chris Reed, come on.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
It could be for you. No one gets away without a question. So do we have any questions from folks here in the audience or from folks out on Zoom? I can check the chat and the Q&A.
Could you say a little more about the evolution of the idea of slavery from the Greek, based on captives and debts, to the racial aspect that became so predominant?
Sure. Yeah. So one of the really striking things that you learn pretty quick.
Move that way a little.
Oh, so they can see on the camera. Okay. So one of the really striking things you learn pretty quick if you study ancient slavery is how little the ancients actually tried to justify slavery. And actually, you could extend this to a very large number of other topics too. We live in a modern age where we really feel a strong compulsion to explain things. We have a very well-established theoretical apparatus for almost everything we do. But if you think about it, most of the time when people do things, we just do them and we don't think too hard about them. The 1780s, when Clarkson is writing, is really a foundational time because this is when people are finally coming up with affirmative explanations for why slavery should exist beyond, well, you got caught, right? And ultimately, what is produced in this decade is the racial theory of slavery, explaining why not all people are equal. Clarkson wants everyone to be equal. His opponents, including Gilbert Franklin, are very strong believers of human inequality. So how did people in antiquity justify slavery then? You can really divide the ancients when they thought about slavery, which is not always, into three categories. The easiest interpretation is the one I showed you way back in the slide deck, which is Florentinus, right? This is what I would call a functionalist description, which is to say it explains that slavery exists and this is how it exists, right? There we go, right? This is, basically you are enslaved if you are caught. Nature wants you to be free, but nature's fine if you're not, right? One sort of very common extrapolation from this is what one might call an effective or affective explanation for slavery. And when we find this going all the way back to the Homeric poems in Greek tragedy, the person who's, the two people who I think do a best job of explaining this justification are Seneca in his 47th epistle and St. Paul in his letter to Philemon. And this is an argument that slavery is sort of like childbirth. It's really painful and it's bad. And we need it, right? And we should have a lot of sympathy for enslaved people. Seneca particularly has this very compelling argument. He says, we all come, we're all, or the human race, the humanum genus, is ortum ex istem seminibus, which is to say, we all come from the same roots, right? There's one humanity. We are all emotionally, naturally, whatever, exactly the same, right? We're one human race. Just some people have good lives and some people have bad lives. And if you're having a good life, your life might be very bad soon. This is not what we would call a very advanced or well-developed theory, but it makes sense in a world that doesn't have the miracles of modern medicine, or in which even very wealthy people might end up finding themselves in a very sad situation very soon. The most notorious ancient theorization for slavery, although honestly one of the least influential until the Renaissance, is Aristotle's explanation for slavery in the first book of his Politics, which is written in the 4th century BCE, where he puts together a theory of what some people call natural slavery, which as far as I can tell, even Aristotle is confused whether he believes or not. This is the idea that everybody is made for a purpose, and some people are made to be masters and other people are made to be slaves. Now, the problem for Aristotle is that you can't really figure out whether someone deserves to be a master or a slave by looking at them, right? He plays with what you might call early racial ideas, which is to say, there should be a science of figuring out who ought to be enslaved, right? But he runs into this basic problem, which is heredity, because he observes that oftentimes people who are very smart have very stupid children, and oftentimes people who are very strong have very weak children. And then he arrives at this point where he says, well, if nature made certain people to be enslaved, we know that slaves do hard work. And then why is it that free people are better looking than slaves and are stronger than slaves? Because slaves should have the bodies of the gods if they're lifting rocks all the time. He sort of very infamously backs off from this idea. But the person who revives it is Juan Gines de Sepulveda in the 16th century, when he's trying to come up with a justification for enslaving the indigenous peoples of the New World. This idea that Aristotle has is not once cited in antiquity itself. It's not cited by anyone up until the 13th century, when Thomas Aquinas seems familiar with it. It's briefly popular in the Renaissance, and then basically the story of early modern jurisprudence in the North is people saying, no, Aristotle has a bad idea, because if you start calling one demographic natural slaves, it's pretty easy to call anyone you don't like a natural slave. And so that's the way the ancients tend to think about it. Their theories of slavery are simply just not very complex.
Did we have another question?
Yeah, Michelle.
So is what you're saying is in ancient times, there was not a race-based system. It's why, because I took a course in art history, and the teacher pointed out in images from classical times where you have a white person and a black person, and the caption had been, well, black person was a slave. Well, there's no proof of that. So when did this idea of like black-based inferiority come from? Because it come from ancient times, right?
Yeah. And so, in fact, I about half of my 2024 book is on this topic, so you're in luck. I actually argue that slavery in antiquity is race-based, but I have a different apparatus for doing this than people typically would have done, in classrooms in the 20th century. So if we define race as the use of human diversity, right, the morphology of what people look like or ideas of who their ancestors were, to justify why they should be enslaved, then there is race-based slavery in antiquity. Because there's plenty of people who are conquered by the Romans and end up enslaved, and their groups continue to be enslaved for generations. And that group, whether the Frisians of Asia Minor or the Thracians of the Balkans, they become metonymic for an enslaved person, right? So from that perspective, slavery in antiquity is racial. But the way it's not racial, right, is that one of the theories that people developed to justify slavery in the second half and really the last quarter of the 18th century, right, is that slavery is the fate of the peoples of Africa, right? Racialized slavery, it's how the Atlantic world works for, good 4 centuries. The reason why people developed this in the late 18th century is the fact that these theories of human equality have become so popular, and people feel the need to develop theories of human inequality. And at the same time that Clarkson is writing his essay, Thomas Jefferson is in Paris writing notes on the state of Virginia, and he's coming up with one of the first theories of polygyny, which is to say that there are multiple races of human beings, not just one, and they're unequal. And that's why it's okay to enslave people that look different from you. And this will develop over the next generation. And so slavery, from what you might call a critical race perspective in antiquity, is racialized. I am certain of it. But in the sense of slavery is permanently an institution that's designed for people of a specific group over a very long period of time. For instance, all peoples of Africa should be enslaved, is not a theory that the ancients develop. So again, critical race perspective, ancient slavery is racialized, but from a more prosaic perspective of, is there a strong justification for slavery based on demographics? It's not.
Greg. So part of what you're talking about is confusing because of the word race, right? Race in ancient Greek wasn't black versus white versus Asian. It was the Persians, the Egyptians, also the people that you know more about. And we're talking 4,000 years of history, and for like 200-300 races where slavery has been focused on black versus white. When all that other racism you talk about is not necessarily, the Gosselin had slaughtered people, they took people in for slavery. They were different than them. But is that racism? It's all complicated.
Yeah, I mean, my argument, which not everyone agrees with, is that slavery itself generates ideas of race. And that, for instance, if you look at specific groups, so I'm a Greek historian by training. If you look, in First Millennium Greece, for instance, there is this pervasive racialization of the peoples of the Balkans and from the peoples who live north of the Black Sea, Ukraine, modern day Russia, right? You see, whether it's Athenian vase painting or it's Attic old comedy, you see, the circulation of these tropes, which really look like stuff from 19th century minstrelsy. And it's a different group of people, right? But the institution of slavery is producing specific needs and specific forms of stereotype to the extent that you have all of the tropes that we so associate with enslaved Africans in the 18th and 19th century with the whitest of white people, who are the peoples of the North Black Sea. Which is to say that race is a contingent, evolving, changing category over time. And so when you say that there's no race in antiquity, or that slavery in antiquity is not race focused, in a certain way, you are right, because all of the races are different, and they're racializations, forms of racism that do not exist anymore. Because they don't serve a social purpose. But in that period, they do serve a social purpose, and that's why I say that slavery in antiquity is racialized. If that answers your question.
But you're using the term race, and now semantics saying is it ethnic based rather than race based?
Right. So ethnicity and race are two overlapping and confusing concepts, right? When we talk about race, we are talking about forms of discrimination which are rooted in phenotype, one, second, ideas of ancestry. Ethnicity is not necessarily associated with a form of discrimination, although it can be associated with discrimination. Ethnicity is associated with ideas of ancestry primarily. These are overlapping categories. These are confused categories. And if you look at any of the American case law, it is very, very confused. And this means they're very, this means that when we see terms like ethnicity and race used in similar contexts, any level of confusion is basically fair. But the main difference that people will point to, right? Race is associated with discrimination, and it's foregrounding the body in a way that ethnicity is not.
So we're gonna give Chris a
Yeah.
chance to catch his breath. And
Here,
we'll
Dee, why
say-
don't you come over?
We'll do a question that's not about the race side of this topic, which is really the question about the editions of the actual printed essay. Because you mentioned to me a lot of people didn't read the original in its printed form, so maybe you can go to the
Yeah, here, in the camera.
Tell
Yeah.
us a little bit about like what was the print run? Like how many of these were printed
Yeah.
and how was it distributed?
Yeah, so the original Latin essay is incorporated into the longer print edition without saying where is it. It had the passages are all the same. We've traced it. Where does through the translation? Where does it show up in Clarkson's own translation in the Latin essay? The essay on the slavery. There's no way you could tell what was in the original Latin essay, but it hasn't changed in the wording or in the argumentation. It's a very consistent arguer all through the book, particularly parts 1 and 2, and then there's this huge edition, part 3, based largely on all this new material in natural science and polygyny versus monogamy, polygyny versus monogyny, and lots of new information. It starts with that dialogue between the African and the Christian. So people would have no idea when they read the essay what was actually in the original essay. That's what we can show because of the translation. So what was the end of that question?
So like how was it distributed?
Oh, so it was distributed very widely. I don't know the print run. It was immediately sent to the United States to be reprinted, and it shows up in Ireland, as I said. It gets translated rapidly. I can't quite say how much I'm trying to remember the likely number. I think 500 was considered a large print run in London at the time. I suspect this was bigger, and because they knew they had a hit on their hands. Now, James Phillips, his publisher, printed a lot of different abolitionist writers. He had a whole corral of authors, and this field of literature just boomed. Between about 1785 and 1786, there was this explosion of anti-slavery writing by Black authors as well as white authors. I highly recommend James Basker's Library of America collections of Black authors and anti-slavery authors in the Age of Revolution. Really great collections in the Library of America, James Basker. This reaction in many ways to the logical implications of the American Revolution. America just fought a revolution about liberty, and Britain claims to be the land of liberty. They actually have a fight over slavery during the revolution, a polemical fight, a pamphlet fight over which of them was worse about slavery. And I tell you, Britain was worse on the slave trade. The United States was worse on slavery, hands down. Though I have to say, the West Indies, those colonies were the worst of all. But Britain was the leading slave trader in the Atlantic world. They were purchasing kidnapped people and forcing the West Indies to the rate of 80,000 people a year at the time Clarkson was writing. This was a very profitable, active commerce. So it raised a lot of concerns, and ultimately the anti-slavery people did win over public opinion in Britain within a couple of decades. In the United States, it took a long time, and some public opinion has not changed, alas, in our country on many of these issues. But they did ultimately win. It was all about shaping that public opinion and forcing first Parliament and the United States Congress to respond. So that's where the Latin essays print edition sits. You wouldn't know reading it what was part of the essay or not. You couldn't possibly know. And Clarkson, to this extent, Gilbert Franklin had a bit of a point that Clarkson was exaggerating things, or I suspect it was probably his publisher who insisted on saying, this won the prize because it was such a big deal. It does say with additions. It does say that.
Well, there are other questions in some of the chat on Zoom, but we're at the top of the hour, so I'm gonna have to send those to you and you're gonna give me some
That's
of those
fine.
responses and we can get them back to some of our participants.
You bet.
But for now, I'm gonna ask you to join me in thanking our two
Yeah.
speakers.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Christopher Parmenter. I'm gonna jump in here and just say goodbye.
I'm a member, by the way.
Thank you again to Dee Andrews and Christopher Parmenter, and to you for coming to this Book Club of California program, either here in person or joining us online. Thanks again for being with us. You can register for any of our programs using the email that you're probably getting from the Book Club now, which lists all of our programs and forms to sign up to participate either online or in person. We'd love to have you come to another Book Club event. So thanks everyone for being with us. Hopefully we'll see you again soon. I hope you have a great evening. Thank you.